Hello, welcome everyone. It's great to see you all poised, I hope, with your questions, comments and challenges to our guest today, who has had a life of adventure, of being captured, of exploration and literary and Hollywood success. Yes, all of that is true. And as I reach over, we are talking a bit about his latest book, but he's written so many books that if I can find it here, if that comes up at all, here. Where is it? There we go. That's it. They fall off the page. There are so many of them. 33 in all. I think this makes it 34. I might be wrong. Land, How the Hunger of Ownership Shaped the Modern World. But over his long career, there's much more. He has been on British territory as it was invaded by a foreign power. He has been imprisoned by a dictatorship. He has been banned from Britain's most far-flung colonial possession. I think it's the most far-flung. He will correct me if I'm wrong. I first met him in 1986 when we were both covering the civil war in Sri Lanka. So in the Goldster Register of Interests, I have to note that he is a good friend of long standing. Simon Winchester, wonderful to see you, and it's fantastic that you can join us on Goldster Inside Story. Great. And now what time is it there, Simon?
I couldn't be more pleased, Humphrey. It is 3 minutes past 7 in the morning, and it's cold. I'm in Massachusetts. Lovely. The sun is coming up behind me, and I've just fed the chickens and plodged through the fresh snow, and because winter has not released its grip, and I think we're due for an enormous storm this weekend, but gradually things are getting warmer. So
oh my goodness,
that's what Massachusetts is like.
Thank you for getting up early for us, or probably not early, because you probably get up at 4 to feed the chickens and all the rest of it. Now, let's talk about about land. The Financial Times says it packs a wealth of ideas in human drama and gives a fresh views of centuries of social conflict. And land, I mean, we're seeing in Ukraine, we're seeing in property prices and everything. It is a compelling topic, isn't it? So can you encapsulate all that for us?
Well, it's a huge topic, and the basic thesis is, I suppose, who owns the land on which we live and have our being. One of the answers is, of course, the Queen, who has a great deal, not only in Britain, but all around the world. She is, I believe, the world's largest private landowner. But also, how do we get it? I mean, we got it, we fought for it, and we invaded it, and took it away from people like Native Americans in this country where I live at the moment. And what do we do with it when we've got it? Do we treat it well? Do we pollute it? Do we dig it up and get minerals from it and leave it in ruin? And what should we do with it? So it's I mean, that's a very brief summary, but it looks in some detail all over the world at ways in which we have acquired, dealt with, and in some cases, started to give land back. I mean, a classic example, I suppose, and the model for how I think we should deal with land is New Zealand, where we're slowly, very slowly, inching towards giving some land back to the Maoris from whom we stole it. But that's a rare beacon of light. And when you see people that own millions of acres in this country, which should by right belong to the Cherokee or the Seminole or whoever, and they'll never give it back, you think this is a monstrous unfairness, not least because the Cherokee and the Seminole cared for it, regarded it, as they say, as our mother. Whereas what do? We just build tract housing or dig it up for iron ore and so forth. So it's a complicated book, fun to write. And
you dedicated it to Chief Standing Bear, didn't you, on that theme?
I did, because that's a classic example, really, of the way that we white people treat often Aboriginal people, Native Americans, First Nation in Canada, Aborigines in Australia, Maoris in New Zealand, not as human beings. I mean, they're just, we invade a place and we think, oh, these are amusing creatures. They're sort of like marsupials or possums or whatever. They're not people. So it took until 1879 when this chap called Standing Bear, rather magnificent fellow, went to the Supreme Court of the United States and said, come on, I'm a human being, I'm not a rabbit. And they said, yeah, okay, you are. So you are entitled to the same rights as anybody else. And that was a landmark case.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an astonishing
You
fact.
say declared to be a person, which actually
Exactly,
struck me.
yeah.
That was the US Supreme Court declared a human being to be a human being.
Precisely. And the extraordinary thing is that America became independent in 1776, but it wasn't until 1923, nearly 200 years later, that Native Americans, whose land it was, though they didn't consider that they owned it, but who lived there, were declared to be citizens of the United States. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Yes,
the people that lived there are not citizens of the country that they've lived in since time immemorial.
And you begin very touchingly. There are two elements I want to discuss about this. One is Ukraine, which is going on at the moment, a big grab of land going on there. But very touchingly, you begin by talking about how you bought your first batch of quite substantive land in New York State, but also how it touched you, how emotional it was for you because of your own background.
Yes, I grew up in England. My parents lived in Rutland. I was brought up in Dorset. Came over here. I mean, my parents owned virtually nothing. We're very pretty poor, low middle class or something. Came here, bought a little cottage after I left Hong Kong, when we first were fooling around together, and so I bought this house, and it was surrounded. It's in a little village called Wassaic in upstate New York, and it was surrounded by pretty useless, quite pretty, but pretty useless land. And the chap that hunted for deer on that land came to me one day and said, look, I live in the Bronx and it's 150 miles to come and shoot a deer. Why don't I sell it to you and give you, sort of a surrounding protection, if you like. So the price was right, so I bought it. And I didn't think very much about it until I became a citizen of this country. And that was, to me, I mean, the actual citizenship ceremony, which was held on the afterdeck of the USS Constitution, which is the oldest floating warship in the world. It's in Boston Harbor. And so there was this ceremony, and I've become an American. And all of a sudden, owning this land, which I went to see the next day. And I'm not going to say I did the sort of Pope thing of falling to my knees and kissing it, but I did think, this is mine. I'm invested in this country, quite literally. I own, although ownership is this weird thing, but I possess a piece of America. And so, yes, it was an emotional connection to the country. That was then. I mean, whether I'm delighted at being an American citizen today is another question, but then, 10 years ago, I was very proud.
Yeah. And we had Jeff Payne on recently, who's an urban planner, and he's written a book called Somewhere to Live. But he was talking about land or property from once being a sense of community and where people live to becoming basically a financial asset, particularly in Britain. Would you agree with that?
Well, up to a point, Lord Copper. The thing is now that, yes, land is the only thing that won't fly away, as Trollope said. Land is the only thing worth living for, worth working for, worth dying for, as they said in Gone with the Wind. So don't sell Tara.
Yes.
But that's no longer quite true because of global warming, because of climate change, particularly in, let's say, the east of the United States, where land that people owned is now becoming part of the Atlantic Ocean. So it's not quite as solid an asset as it used to be. And the interesting thing is, and I don't think it's necessarily anything, there's no real connection, is that communities are beginning to own land again in the way that they used to thousands, hundreds of years ago. And of course, this is happening in Britain, most notably in Scotland, with places like the Isle of Egg and so forth, falling into community ownership. And I think I very much approve of that. Communities looking after the land on which they live, rather than some rapacious developer owning it and holding it just to make money.
Can we move into the bigger political sphere now, from that very personal feeling that you had, and we have a sort of political, personal feeling of hostilities going on now in Ukraine. And you have a very telling chapter writing there, Death on the Rich Black Earth, you call it, where you tell us about the Ukraine famine, where there's land, the food is being used to starve people, the hostility that went on. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, basically in the late 1920s, early 1930s, Stalin had this plan to collectivize the farms in the Ukraine, to bring in the wheat. And I mean, Ukraine, the central of Ukraine, is like Kansas, Nebraska. It's just full of waving fields of wheat. It's the breadbasket of Western Europe. And so he said, we've got to get as much grain grown there and exported from there for the factories of the new Bolshevik nation of the USSR. And he imposed these rules, which were insane in scale and the way they were executed, in a very, very harsh way. And the details are absolutely tragic, but they say between 8 and 10 million people starved to death. It's called the Holodomor, the mass starvation. I mean, it was literally a genocide perpetrated by Stalin. So and basically, there are all sorts of journalistic stories which are fascinating, which is that Walter Duranty, who was the New York Times correspondent in Moscow at the time, said, oh, nothing's going on, Stalin's a great guy. And the New York Times printed his stuff while a young Welshman called Gareth Jones went down. I think it was Jones, it might have been Evans.
Yes, it was Gareth
went down,
local newspaper.
Went down on his own to Ukraine and found these stick-like figures and dying people in the streets, and was horrified and wrote a piece for, I think it appeared in the Evening Standard, and saying this is outrageous. And Duranty said, no, no, no. And there's a picture of Duranty being served fine wines in his apartment in Moscow. And the New York Times, for some while later, said, well, this Welshman is wrong. Russia's, Soviet Union's fine shape, and we must believe Duranty. But then eventually, after Malcolm Muggeridge wrote a piece for The Guardian saying, or the Manchester Guardian as it was then, saying that this is an outrage, the world started to take notice. And there's been an interesting controversy recently in that they've tried, and Duranty is obviously long dead, to take away his Pulitzer Prize, which he got for his reporting.
Yes,
and the Pulitzer Committee won't do it. The New York Times has said our correspondent was wrong. The Pulitzer people say he must continue to have his prize. Anyway, so I went down there with a very nice young woman called Maria Kravchenko, who I'm in touch with every day now, because she's now in a bunker and with her little child, Juliana, and her husband, sheltering from this similar genocide, if you like, that's going on today. So I feel a tremendous connection to Ukraine.
Absolutely. It was, it's interesting, when you were saying that, I was thinking of the parallels that we're getting now in Britain and in the US a bit about the Russian oligarchs and all those connections that we've had that everybody said was going to be absolutely fine. And now suddenly overnight, they're not fine. These are evil people that have to be exposed. My colleague, John Sweeney, actually wrote a book called, a novel called Useful Idiots about that and about the Welsh reporter and everything like that. But this fast, you have a unique perspective because you've been to so many places over so many years. But could I take you back to April the 2nd, 1982, which is almost 40 years ago coming up to it. Where were you and what happened, Simon?
Well, a few days prior to that, I was in India. I was in Simla doing a piece on the deteriorating state of the Simla Fire Brigade, which was one Land Rover and a couple of buckets of sand to put out the fires in these beautiful, beautiful buildings. Yeah. And the Sunday Times, for whom I was working, sent me a telegram in the days where you got telegrams saying, return to London immediately. And I thought it was some problem with my expenses, which you will recognize as a perennial problem with journalists. So I went down to Delhi and took that night's flight back to London and turned up. Cal McChrystal, who recently died, was the foreign editor. And he said, oh yes, we think there's a spot of bother in the South Atlantic. Would you care to go down there? So I said, all right. And this being the potential invasion of the Falkland Islands. Mm. So I flew that night to Buenos Aires, and I had one friend who I went to school with, a chap called Mark Heathcote, who worked in the British Embassy in BA under the cover of being
Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina.
I beg your pardon,
yeah.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we had lunch in, would you believe, Claridge's Hotel. There is one in Buenos Aires. Yeah. And I said, there's all this talk about invasion. And he said, well, I can't say a lot, but put it this way. There is a weekly flight from southern Patagonia into the Falklands, which goes tomorrow, once a week, you'll be able to get on the flight and go there, but whether you'll be able to get back is another matter. So that was not as good as a wink to a blind horse. So I got on the plane, went off to Port Stanley, and indeed, 3 days later, it was invaded. So the whole excitement of watching the Argentine troops, and it was an extraordinary moment. I mean, the night before, I got a call from Government House. Would I step lively and go and see the governor, this nice little man called Rex Hunt?
Yeah.
So I went to the Government House, and he was standing there, ashen, with a telegram which said, intelligence reports show a large fleet of Argentine vessels leaving Bahia Blanca, naval base in Argentina, appeared to be traveling in your direction at what we can only construe as battle speed. So we think that probably you are going to be invaded. Best of British luck, Carrington, who was the then
That's Lord Carrington, yes.
Lord Carrington, and Rex said, so what do I do? I said, I'm just a reporter. I don't know. You're the governor. This is your moment. And he said, but I've never encountered anything like this in my life. I was blameless district commissioner in Uganda. What do I do? I said, well, I tell you what, my only advice to you is declare a state of emergency. Always good. He said, what a capital idea. So he went on the radio and declared one. And so you had all these local chaps with wooden makeshift rifles watching as the Argentine amphibious vehicles came ashore. And by 9 o'clock in the morning, I remember I was in Government House, sheltering under his bed. Mabel, his wife, was drinking brandy and soda all night and getting sort of sloshed while this invasion was going on. And the Argentine admiral came in, and Rex surrendered. And there was this photograph, which I took, of our boys, our Marines, being disarmed by Argentine soldiers with bayonets and so forth. And I took some pictures, and
they let you take the pictures, did they? They didn't.
Well, they did. They were very happy that someone should record their moment of glory as they took down the British flag and rolled up, the Argentine bandera. But the interesting thing was that, how do I get the pictures out? Because they'd cut off all communications. I thought, well, the governor was going to be deported to Uruguay. So I said, could you I typed up something on my, if you remember, Olivetti Lettera 32 typewriter. I typed up my story, gave it to him. He put it in his boots. He went out in his
in his plumed hat that they had.
Yes. They made him take it off, and they found my story in his boots, and they ripped it up in front of me. But his son, who was a 16-year-old boy at school somewhere in England, was there for the holidays. And I said to him, look, this is a very personal question, but do you wear boxer shorts or briefs? And he said, personal question, but I wear briefs. And I said, well, look, this 35mm canister of film, could you smuggle it where the sun doesn't shine? And he did, and the Argentine search people didn't find it. And the Reuters correspondent in Montevideo, where the plane went to, said, do you have anything? And he said, yes, I've got this rather aromatic roll of film. And she developed it, and that picture was all over the front pages the next day.
Well, when you remember that, and you see what happened in Ukraine, I know it's totally different, but there must be a sense of when do you surrender, when do you not surrender, how big is this, and that sense of infringement or violation. What was that with you as a British citizen and the Marines particularly?
Well, yes, I mean, I've got myself into quite a bit of trouble because there is a famous case in the 1920s of the Åland Islands, which are contested between Finland and Sweden. Yeah. And in the end, a court case over which we, the British, presided in the 20s, said that they should remain, if I got it right, under Finnish sovereignty, but Swedish administration. It could be the other way around. So I've always thought that these islands of ours, which are populated, yes, by British people by and large, should symbolically be under Argentine administration, sorry, Argentine sovereignty,
yes.
but British administration.
Yes.
So
yes.
that there'll be no argument about who owns, once again, that funny word, owns the land,
Yeah.
but that the British should have absolute rights to drive on the left and eat fish and chips and do what they normally do.
Yeah.
That was greeted with a howl of annoyance from the shires in Britain. But I think it's the only way to avoid a future conflict, and there will be bound to be a future conflict.
And something similar, I mean, it's probably too late now, could have been hatched out for Ukraine and these other frozen conflicts that are going around.
Frozen conflict, what a wonderful term, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the Ukraine thing, well.
But you did a book some years back called Outposts, which shows your love for wild, far-flung, unknown places, doesn't it?
Well, certainly the British Empire, as such as it is at the moment, they are pretty wild and far-flung. I mean, what are they? They're Gibraltar, which is obviously fairly close to home. And then there's 5 in the Caribbean: Anguilla, Turks and Caicos, Montserrat, British Virgin Islands, and the Caymans.
Yes.
And then the string of Ascension, St. Helena, wonderful, wonderful place, and Tristan da Cunha, British Antarctic Territory, South Georgia, Pitcairn Island in the Pacific.
Pitcairn's mutiny on the Bounty, mutiny on the Bounty Descendants, isn't it?
Yeah, that 1789, same year as the French Revolution. Yes. So yeah, and then Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean,
right,
and Hong Kong, of course, which when I did the book was a British colony.
Now you've had a couple of upsets with these outposts. Obviously, they don't share your cultural values, but you went to you went to Tristan da Cunha. I mean, Tristan da Cunha is literally in the middle of nowhere, isn't it? It's thousands of miles from anywhere, with about 250 people on it, and you have managed to get yourself banned from there, haven't you? You can even show us that the banning the banning stamp in your passport.
Yeah, I've got a banning stamp, which is, I don't know whether you'll be able to see it, but there it is. It's got the albatross, and there is the volcano that is Tristan, and the crown, of course, and then written across it in rubric in red, it says "not permitted to land," signed by the customs officer, who's also the policeman and the minister of the church, and goodness knows how many other things. So yeah, that's a badge of honor, dishonor.
But how come? I mean, what did you do to upset them so much?
Well, not exactly the gravest of crimes, I think. In 1950, no, well, I'll go back a bit. In the 1940s, Tristan da Cunha was declared to be a ship. It was called HMS Atlantic Isle.
Right.
It was recalibrated within the empire. And as a ship, the governor, there was a little governor, he was kicked off and a naval officer was put in his place. The idea was that this was a fixed battleship from which Britain could make sure there were no German submarines in the South Atlantic. So it was run as a ship, and the lieutenant, called Derek, I think Derek might have been David Boy, B-O-O-Y, fell in love with one of the island girls. He never touched her. He said hello, and she whispered hello back. And when they departed in 1945, she came to the beach to wave him off and was seen to be weeping. So from those 2 events, he believed that this girl was in love with him. And he wrote a tender memoir of his time on HMS Atlantic Isle, on Tristan, which was published in Britain in about 1955. And I read it and I thought, this is so touching. I must, if I ever go down to Tristan, I must go and see the girl he fell in love with. So I went down, and she's now 40 years later, so she's a mature woman, married to the chief islander. And he said, no, you're not to see her. It's a disgusting book. Filth. I mean, it was absolutely nothing to do with filth.
Yeah.
But he refused to let me see her and essentially said, go away. But nonetheless, I'm afraid, irresponsibly and cruelly and whatever, callously, when I got to writing Outposts, I did include a paragraph from David or Derek Boy's book saying, I saw this girl, I smelled her hair or something. And for that, I didn't know what went on really, but when they read it, they went
One paragraph.
berserk. One paragraph, quoting a book written 40 years, 50 years before.
Yeah.
So I went down there on a small cruise vessel, National Geographic, I think, to lecture on the Falklands, on South Georgia, which has, of course, come back into the news because of the find of Shackleton's ship Endurance the other day, and Tristan. So we approached Tristan, if you can imagine, when I'm giving this expansive lecture about everything to do with this island that everyone was evacuated because there was a volcanic eruption and they all went off to live in Leon Solent or somewhere, hated it and came back.
And then they wanted to come back, didn't they? After
oh
that?
yeah, they thought that England was awful, full of cars and lifts and pollution and stuff, politicians. And so I gave this expansive lecture. We then dropped anchor, and the launch with officials came on board and said, "Is there a Mr. Winchester?" And I thought, oh, this is my moment to shine. It was quite the reverse. "You will not be permitted to land on this island." And I said, "Why on earth not?" And the Americans, they're nearly all Americans, said, "This is ridiculous. You can't kick someone off a part of
British territory, isn't it?
For writing something they didn't like. You know, could you be banned from Yorkshire for writing that someone in Dewsbury had an affair with the vicar's wife or something? No." So anyway, I was banned, and then I went back a couple more times, and each time I went with my wife and had the indignity of she being allowed on, and me not. Burly policeman said, and I tried to get in by using an American passport, and instead of Simon Winchester, using my middle names, which are Bernard, Adrian. But they saw through this ruse, unfortunately. They rumbled me, yes. And they sent me, and I'll finish this because I know people will get terribly bored. But the current, or the then administrator, was someone I knew from Islamabad. He had been a British undersecretary in the British embassy in Pakistan. And I wrote to him and I said, I'm coming down there and I might see you again. And he said, "I hope so. It'd be lovely to have tea and reminisce about the Himalayas and so forth." And but then he sent me a message. He said, "The Island Council has met." By this time, everyone involved had died. I mean, the young woman had died, the chief islander had died. We've moved on. But the Island Council had met, and to use his phrase, he said, "I'm afraid they have decided," to quote them, "that Mr. Winchester will not be allowed to visit Tristan da Cunha on this occasion, or indeed ever."
Goodness. I mean, it's an incredible little story. I mean, small story, because I was thinking of going out there once on a BBC film and trying to argue the case on what you said to let you be able to be allowed back there. But this is and this was a small paragraph in Outposts, was it? So it was
it was absolutely.
It was a paragraph in a book that was written many years ago. Now, all of you tuning in, listening, ask Simon anything you want. Look at his books, almost anything, and he'll say no comment, like a good diplomat if you can't answer it. You know, bring in your thoughts here, because there are amazing stories we're going to hear. And I'd like to move on from Tristan, as you talked about them leaving because of the volcano and then coming back. And now we've got this very fascinating thing about the Chagos Islands, and which is Diego Garcia. Explain that situation to us. And these islanders that sort of, they literally kissed the sand, didn't they, a couple of weeks ago when they went back there?
It is an extraordinary story. The background basically is you've got this archipelago in the middle of the Indian Ocean, about 1,000 miles south of the Maldives, which of course people will know because they go off on fancy holidays there. These islands were complicated, but they were British anyway. It's called British Indian Ocean Territory, BIOT. And there were about 2,000 people living there in the 1960s, working largely on making copra, coconut products, coconut oil, that sort of thing. And they were nearly all Malagasy people from Madagascar, effectively. That's what they were ethnically. But they'd been living on these islands for donkey's years. and they're proper communities with houses and churches and all the rest of it. But then, unbeknown to them, the British government said to the American government, who wanted an airfield in the Indian Ocean, that there was an old RAF airfield on an island called Diego Garcia. And you can have it if you like. Are there any people living there, said the Pentagon? Well, the famous phrase was, there are a few man Fridays, but we'll clear them off.
Not human beings, as you said.
Precisely, it goes back to the point you were making earlier.
Beings, yes.
So the British closed down the copra coconut company, rendering everyone unemployed technically, and then brought in ships overnight. They did this terrible thing of incinerated all the island dogs and took them on these ships westward 1,500 miles to Mauritius and dumped them, quite literally dumped them on the dockside and said, bye.
This was the Royal Navy?
No, this was British government officials from the Home Office,
right,
on
chartered
civilian ships.
Okay.
And so these poor people were left stateless, moneyless, forgotten. No one knew about them. And all we had done, the British, the deal was, we did this in exchange for a £14 million discount on Trident missiles. So we had done the deal, and the Americans then brought in the Seabees and turned this little RAF base into the biggest, busiest airfield in the world, full of B-52 bombers, full of nuclear weapons. And the harbor, the Diego Garcia, is shaped a bit like a child's foot, and the runway on one side of the foot. And the lagoon is now chock-a-block with gigantic cargo ships full of pre-positioned tanks and landing craft and so forth, in case the Americans ever need to go to any Middle Eastern state to the north of them. So it's vitally important for American interests in the Indian
You got
Ocean.
thrown out of there, didn't you? You tried to go and got thrown out again.
I know, it's terrible. I'm certainly banned from there. So now I'm a very nice Australian woman called Ruth Boydell, who was single-handedly sailing a yacht around the world, wanted to go to Diego Garcia, and complicated story, but I met her in Cochin in South India, not far from where you and I met. And I'd never sailed in my life. So she taught me how to sail. The weird thing was, she insisted on being completely naked. And I'm British and I don't do that sort of thing. But anyway, so there am I, naked, incompetently sailing a little schooner. I mean, it was a 30-foot schooner. And we got to Diego Garcia, and there was this weird moment. You sail into the lagoon and you drop anchor, and there are thousands of American servicemen. And there's a nuclear submarine, the USS Corpus Christi, I think it was, and 6 British officials, including a customs officer from Torquay, I think. And he gets on the boat and makes all the usual questions. You know, do you have any firearms and so forth? And let's see your passports. So Ruth gave her Australian passport. I gave my British passport.
And you've got clothes on at this time, I presume.
Yeah, by this time I put a pair of shorts on. I believe,
right.
Yes. I'm meeting a Home Office official, of course. And he looks at my passport and he said, I don't know if you remember, Humphrey, but in those days, there was a space for occupation, I think it was called.
Indeed,
and the thing to put was farmer, because everyone loves a farmer.
Manager or teacher.
But I didn't.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I put representative, which one of the anodyne words.
Yeah.
So I'm a representative. And he said, representative of what? And I said, publishing. And he said, wouldn't be publishing newspapers, would it, Mr. Winchester? And I said, how can you? He said, well, look at this. And he pulled out from his clipboard a telex, rather a letter, a photocopy of it that I had sent to the Foreign Office 6 months before, asking for permission to go to Diego Garcia and being refused. And he said, you have been refused to enter here. We've been tracking your movements for the last 3 months. We saw when you left Cochin and blah, blah, blah. And you have now inveigled this innocent Australian woman to take you to Diego Garcia, you must leave immediately. And if you don't, we'll impound your boat, we'll fly you back to Britain, and you can whistle for getting your boat back.
Oh, goodness, yeah.
So we said, well, can we stay for 48 hours? And they said yes. And when he had gone, a little Liberty boat from the USS Corpus Christi came up and said, hey, you guys, I gather you're being thrown out. There's a party tonight on this nuclear submarine. So off we were, had a rare old time. But then eventually we were forced to leave, and a British destroyer, frigate, I think, actually,
so you
escorted us out and made sure we left.
There's an interesting question from Patricia Rees here, because you've been thrown out of so many of these far-flung places. Now the Chinese are building islands, aren't they? And are you going to pop onto a yacht and try to visit one of those? And where are they building them? Tell us about those.
Well, they're in the South China Sea, the Spratly and the Paracel Islands, and they've been doing this now for many years. They said that there's something called the 9-dash line, which looks like an enormous sort of udder extending from South China around Hainan Island, and essentially saying that all the waters to the west of the Philippines and to the east of, what's it called, Borneo,
yes,
are Chinese. And so all the little reefs and skerries belong to China, which in international law they don't. So we're going to build them up and put warplanes and ships, docking facilities and so forth on them, which they have been doing. And I remember a long time ago, I took a container ship from, I think it was called Port Swettenham in those days, it was now called Port Klang in Malaysia, to Hong Kong. And we went past, it was a British ship called the Cardigan Bay, and we went past one of these islands, and the captain was taking photographs from the bridge wing. And when he got to Hong Kong, he was met by a naval intelligence officer and handed over his film. So people were already, and this was in the
80s?
early 90s, I think. They
Yes,
were aware
early
that
90s. When I was in Beijing, we got the first pictures of them putting up the interesting thing about these islands, Simon, is that they're all named after sort of colonial seafarers, aren't they? Mischief Reef and Johnson Reef and Woody Island and all the rest of it. It's all, but you don't feel tempted, do you, to sort of do a last fling on a yacht that ends up in the Spratly Islands to go and have some rice noodles with the Chinese?
Humphrey, I'm 78 now, and the greatest excitement in my life is feeding my chickens each morning. So I think not. It's a weird thing to say. During the pandemic, and I've been stuck here, I go down to New York City quite a bit. I came to London once last October, I think, and actually came to the Travelers Club, where I believe you are now, and to do some research for a book I'm working on at the moment. But I know this is a terrible thing to confess, but I feel I've lost the taste for travel. I love being where I am. Not sure about America, but I love being in a library.
In a place, surrounded by
I feel grounded for this going to sound really sloppy and sentimental, but after a whole lifetime of wandering around and being rootless, I like.
So where will you hang your hat? Where you are now, or in Britain, or where will you do that?
I think in Britain, I did a piece a long time ago about when magazines spent money like drunken sailors on all the world's whirlpools. And there are 6 huge whirlpools around the world, of which my favorite is the Corrie Vrecken in Scotland between Scarborough and Jura.
Yeah.
And I wrote a book when I lived on an island very close to the Corrie Vrecken back in the early 2000s. And if I stood on my desk, I could see the little hillock on Jura where George Orwell wrote 1984, and it was called Barn Hill. That was the name of his farm, which is the name that I've given to this farm where I live on here. So I have this tremendous affection, and I've said to people that are likely to be interested in my ashes that they shall go into the Corrie Vrecken whirlpool when I'm gone.
Oh,
whether I think I'll come back to Britain.
Yes.
My last years
You're
there.
not going to buy Barn Hill, are you? Or it's too remote?
It's pretty remote. I mean, you have to.
It is, isn't it?
No, I think it's the short answer.
Suri says it seems that we're still on China. Do you think China is attempting to besiege countries like India by building such islands? Besiege countries like India?
No, I don't think. I mean, China in all her history, with the single exception, of course, of Tibet and her influence in Indochina, has never really been a country that's expanded beyond her own borders. And she has no interest, I don't think. She's got that little bit of contested India called the Aksai Chin, north of Kashmir. But apart from that, I think China simply wants respect. And I'm sounds very sort of airy-fairy thing to say, but you know, ever since the Opium Wars, China's been chopped up by so many colonial powers and gradually got them all back. Got back Macau, got back Hong Kong, got back. There was a British colony called Port Edward up near Beijing, given up in 1930. There's only one remaining territory, and that's Taiwan. And that's the big one, because people were beginning to say, well, it might be sensible of Xi to take Taiwan while the world is looking at Ukraine. I don't think it's going to happen. But the American response, what would it be? They are obliged to treaty obligations to defend Taiwan, but I can't see it happening.
You know, there's a lot of stuff moving around in the world at the moment, because we've touched on it almost accidentally, but it's definitely there. But you did do a book called The Men Who United the States, and I think that's a fantastic title there. But give us an idea in today's world, this concept of bonding different cultures, languages, economies under a single umbrella. I mean, it sort of happened with Europe, but you know, now Britain left, and there's all of Russia is an unhappy bunny, as we know. China is doing this, but the United States managed to do it, didn't it?
Well, it sort of did, and it's kind of you to say the Men United States good title. Many women didn't think so, but it was unfortunately to say nearly all these sort of infrastructural and notional means of uniting the country were done by men. It was the early geologists, the early railroad builders, the early highway builders. So I was fascinated by what it was that knitted this extraordinary and huge country together. And I divided the book into 5 categories from the Chinese wood, earth, water, fire, and metal idea. And using those things, saying that, you know, during the Lewis and Clark expedition, everything was wooden canoes and wooden palisades, right up to today, the internet, the electronics that bind the country together. And it sort of worked as a book.
Is there any one thing that you could apply to the US, to Europe, to ASEAN or Asia, Southeast Asia, any one thing like a road or a communication or a leader that will unite regions?
Well, I mean, I was totally opposed to Brexit, totally in favor of the European Union. And it's one of the things I miss very much about Britain at the moment is not so much Britain, but Europe. The thought that I can be sitting in London and get on a train at Euston and be in Venice or Ukraine 2 or 3 hours later. But the infrastructural connections within Europe, the biggest construction project in world history was the construction of the interstate highway system in America, which is an absolute triumph. These great big roads that go hither and yon, you know, maybe nowadays you think it's not, the carbon footprint and so forth is a bad legacy of that road system. But that road system, it goes everywhere. And I can get on, it's 26 minutes to I-90 from here, which was built in the 1950s and 60s. And I can turn left on exit 2 on I-90, the Massachusetts Turnpike, and drive 3,000 miles without a single traffic light and get myself to Seattle. Now that binds a country together.
Yes, that. Emma has moved us on to a place where I was going to. She says, I am reading The Professor and the Madman, and it's fascinating. In your writing, how do you draw boundaries between social history and fiction?
Well, that's this whole genre, which may be ebbing away now, I don't know. It seemed to begin with David Sobel writing Longitude back in the mid-90s, I think.
Mid-90s, wasn't it? Yes.
Yeah, of creative non-fiction, where you take a subject, in her case, John Harrison and the clocks, and the competition to build a clock which would allow sailors to find their accurate position on the face of the sea. Elements of it were, and she warns the reader, imagined. You know, this is what I think John Harrison would have said when the king said, you can't have your money, even though you won the competition. Well, similarly, with the making of the Oxford English Dictionary, there were little parts of it where I surmised this is what happened. And I think it's fair to do that, dangerous to do that, because the temptation is to turn the whole thing into a farrago of fiction. But I think if you warn the reader that what you're about to read or what you've just read is a quote that I think is likely to have been uttered, then it's fair. Yes. So, yes, I tread a fine line between absolute accuracy and fairness.
And then there was it was a huge success when it came out, I think in 1997 or 8. So you would have written it around 1995 or 6. But it didn't hit the screens until 2019. That's what, 22, 23 years later. Yeah. Was that a rough and tumble of Hollywood nightmares that you went through?
It was a total, a cluster, something or other. I won't utter the second part of that phrase. No, it was a mess. Mel Gibson bought the option, which at the time, and I remember sitting in my hotel room and Dustin Hoffman rang me up. I mean, I didn't believe it. I'm sitting in a hotel in Los Angeles, I think, and the phone rings. Hi, this is Dusty. I beg your pardon. Dusty Hoffman, Dustin. And I said, this is a joke, this is some fool. But no, it was him. And he wanted to know, he was interested that Mel Gibson had approached him to play W.C. Minor, the chap that was the sort of hero, if you like, of this book. Did I think he could do the accent properly? I think this is a strange dream world I've entered. I'm just a reporter from England, and I'm advising Dustin Hoffman on whether he can play a paranoid schizophrenic New Englander born in Ceylon, and who became a contributor while sitting in a lunatic asylum in Crowthorne in Berkshire, on whether his accent is any good. Anyway, to cut a very, very long story short, the film was eventually greenlit, and it then became I went over to Dublin, where most of it was filmed. Horrendous, because I mean, it was fun being with Mel Gibson and Sean Penn. I mean, I really liked Sean Penn. What a nice chap he is. But the whole thing was dominated by the election of Donald Trump. I remember lying in bed in the hotel in Dublin, just not imagining that I was seeing Trump being elected and I was going back to the country that had elected him. But anyway, so the film was made, and the director and the crew said, right, we're going off to Oxford now to do a dinner in Christchurch and filming at Oxford University Press and one or two other B-roll stuff. And the producer, a Frenchman in Los Angeles, said, no, you have spent too much money, you cannot go to Oxford. He said, you can't make a film about the Oxford English Dictionary without going to Oxford. He said, well, you're going to have to. Anyway, and the result of that was a complete mess. And everyone resigned, and Gibson wouldn't publicize it, and Sean Penn wouldn't publicize it. And I'm sitting there in this maelstrom and then I myself didn't want to have much to do with it. And I remember I was flying to somewhere, and my wife, we're somewhere over North Dakota, and she nudges me, I'm asleep, and there is on the little screen in front of me, The Professor and the Madman, which is the American title of the book. And I watched, and it was sort of slightly cringe-making. It wasn't a bad film, but
It wasn't a bad
could have
film.
been. No, I know. Thank you, Humphrey.
No, I thought it was, but I think you said it was too sentimental. It was sort of cringy in that respect. But
Yeah,
I thought it was nicely done. I mean, but given the 20 years it took to get it made, it always sort of hanging around at the back of your mind, I guess. What's happening with
always. Is it ever going to be made? Is it ever going to be made?
Yeah.
And then it was, to me anyway, a bit of a damn squib.
Now I just want to.
But it did. The book sells still.
Yes, yeah, and it's getting an anniversary edition coming out soon, isn't it?
It is next year. It's going to be 25 years, so they're bringing out a sort of fancy one. Yeah.
Yes. I just want you to go over, when we were talking yesterday, you said quite fascinatingly how you calculated the number of words you did a day for your books, because you write these are not small books, and you do one every 2 years or so. How do you keep track of that?
Well, I know people are going to hate me for doing this, but I know, I can read it off the left of the screen here. So I'm doing a book at the moment, which I have to deliver on the 30th of June. And I began it on the 1st of November. So from the 1st of November to the 30th of June is 242 days. And it's 150,000 words long, which means WPD at start, words per day at start, 861. So I've so far written the prologue, chapters 1, 2, or parts 1, 2, and 3. The total word count yesterday, 84,585 words done, meaning 65,415 left to do.
Yeah.
111 days to do it in, because that's how many days until 30th June, meaning I have to do 589 words a day, which means I'm sort of ahead. It's like
you're ahead of your time because
I'm ahead, so I can take time off and have conversations with you, which is lovely.
Is that a computer program, or did you devise that yourself?
No, I'm afraid it's just a little thing on a stick-it note, which I do every night before I save what I've written, email it to myself for safety, and then go off and have dinner or whatever.
A couple of points, and then I'm got to go on to what's coming next, and then come back to you. Suri says, no, to answer this, but she makes, China has also grabbed parts of Kashmir, China, and has an expansionist policy, as evidenced by having bases in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, etc. A huge topic. I won't ask you the actual question, do you agree? Because we might be here forever. Emma, back, I think, to this, what are your views on the difference between madness and utter genius? Looks like there might be some conflict here. Apologies to use the word mad. I think, would he be described as having Asperger's or autism in today's world, or how would that work, Simon?
You mean W.C. Minor?
Yeah, yes.
No. He was definitely paranoid schizophrenic, much more serious.
Yes.
And I don't know if you remember, and I don't want to put people off their lunch, but he cut off his penis and threw it in the fire. And so he was, you don't do that if you're Aspergerish, I think. Asperger's I've known.
Absolutely right. Now, just hold there for a second, because we have got coming up Thursday, March 17th, that's next Thursday. I am with Eric Brown, who's done a murder mystery, 1950s, Murder at Standing Stone Manor. But Eric is also an acclaimed science fiction writer and a children's writer, and he did a book called A Monster Ate My Marmite, which I must have a look at before I talk to him. That's a great title. Lucinda is here on March 18th with Melanie Hewitt, Looking for the Durrells. That's a novel of emotional escape. Penny's engagement is broken off. Her father dies. She heads for Corfu, and she's inspired by the books of the naturalist Gerald Durrell. And there she finds adventures and mystery. Then next Friday, we have an author-to-author special. We have Atlantic Council Senior Advisor, Dr. Harlan Ullman from Washington, D.C. He's got a new book out called The Fifth Horseman of the Apocalypse, and he's going to talk about Ukraine and where all that might lead. And then on Thursday, 24th, Arthur Miller. We're going to be looking at artificial intelligence, the artist and the machine. That's the world of AI creativity, the computerized artists, people, the computers that compose music that sounds more like Bach than Bach. These are now computers that will become people in the US Supreme Court or something at a later date as that emerges. And then Friday, the 25th of March, we have Book of the Month. This is debut novel, The Appeal by Janice Hallett. There's a mystery in a small town of Lockwood. It starts with the arrival of two secretive newcomers and ends with a tragic death. Yes, you come from a small community, don't you, of which you're the proprietor of a newspaper, Simon, is that correct?
It is. I just want to say one thing, though. Arthur Miller, who you're talking to about AI, is a very good friend of mine. So he's an American, married to a lady called Leslie Downer.
Absolutely, yes.
You know Leslie. Anyway,
yes.
But do please give him my regards. He's a great man.
I will do that. I will do that. Yes, yes. And Leslie.
But yes, I mean, the newspaper, I have brought a copy hot off the press. I live in a town called Sandisfield, named, if you remember, Duncan Sands, colonial secretary a long time ago. Anyway, this is the same family, Sandisfield. And we have a population of 850. And they all, a few years ago, there was much division in the town. So now 12 years ago, I decided we should have the Sandisfield Times. And here's the latest issue. And at first they hated it, but now they love it. And it comes out every month. It's free and has a circulation. There are people buying it in or getting it in Tasmania, would you believe, and all over the world. But everyone here gets it in the town.
Yes.
And yesterday, and I think I'm allowed to use the word yesterday, because this is sort of live, there was breaking news. The town clerk, threw a man called Kevin Flynn, threw all his toys out of the pram and resigned yesterday morning. Someone tipped me off and I felt like a reporter again. Hastily wrote a story, and we produced a Sandisfield Times bulletin, which went out by 6 p.m. last night on the internet only. And I felt like the old days. You would have loved it.
And you broke the story. So
I broke the news. Yes.
As the proprietor of the Sandisfield Times, and author of many books, what is your greatest achievement? I mean, Onel, which is your favorite book, or is it the job that you've got now that is?
Well, I certainly love what I do. I mean, when you're in the middle of writing a book and suddenly there's a breaking news story, you think, well, wait a minute, I'm ahead of the game. I can deal with this. So that was really exciting. I mean, I began my career as a newspaper reporter in Newcastle upon Tyne in goodness knows when, 68 or something. And my first fire, all sorts of dramatic stories, I loved it. And the adrenaline was coursing through the veins last night. After I spoke to you, when we had our pre-interview chat, this broke 10 minutes after we talked.
So it doesn't leave you, does it? The getting the news out there. I mean, I feel something. However old you are, it's always something you want to do, is tell people things and everything.
Yes, exactly. Tell people things. Yeah.
But of all of these places you've been to, Simon, far-flung or whatever, do you have a favorite spot in the world?
I do, and it is Western Scotland, without a shadow of doubt. I mean, I know it's rather pedestrian thing to say, because you're right. I mean, like you, have been to all sorts of exotic places, but the west of Scotland, I adore it. So a little croft overlooking the sea, seagulls, grey, cold, rainy, no lying on beaches for me. And a few books and
Yes, well, I love the Hebrides, and you mentioned Jura and Isla and Harris and Lewis, and I just love those places. We've got some Sue Townley, wonderful session, a lot of stories. Thank you for your stories, Simon. Lilette Butler says thanks, fascinating, an interesting life. Thanks for Patricia. Thanks for a stimulating discussion. More books to add to my reading list. That's a good thing to know. Emma has got you seem to be very visionary and knowledgeable. Can you share your views on, you've just disappeared because another one's come in, on the impact of this global migration which we are seeing? Do we know where we are heading to? Land has got some of those answers. Give us a 15-second answer to that, Simon. Do we know
where we're going nowhere if we don't stop burning fossil fuel. So we've got to stop the sea level rising. We've got to stop the temperature rising in the sea, which is killing the Great Barrier Reef and so forth. We've got to cool down, quite literally. Cool down, calm down, take it easy, don't be so greedy.
Lovely. Cool down, calm down, take it easy, don't be so greedy. That's it. The great Simon Winchester, proprietor of the Sandersfield Times. Read Land, read all of Simon's books, whichever ones you want. Follow him on Twitter at Simon Writer. Until next Thursday.
Simon W. Writer, actually.
Simon W. Writer, is it? Simon W. Writer.
Sorry about that.
Simon W. Writer. Until next Thursday, when I'm with the monster that ate my Marmite and Eric Brown. Thank you for all our Goldster team. Thank you for your questions, comments in that. And thank you, Simon. So good to catch up with you again.
It's been great fun. We'll see each other soon in the Hebrides, maybe.
In the Hebrides. And stay involved, everybody. Stay active. And above all, stay safe. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.